and welcome. I'm Ron Cassimer, Vice President of Programs at the Social Science Research Council, or SSRC, and I have the honor of welcoming you to today's panel on aging sustainably in 21st century Japan. The SSRC is a private nonprofit organization that will celebrate its 100th birthday next year. Our mission for all these years has been to promote social science research and its use using a range of tools, fellowships and capacity building, deepening the craft of social science, building research networks across disciplines and world regions on major public issues, and communicating new understandings to a wide range of stakeholders. On behalf of all of today's sponsors, it is a pleasure to have you join us for this virtual Abe Fellows Global Forum, an initiative of the Abe Fellowship Program of the SSRC and the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. The forum is designed to share Abe Fellows' research and insights on pressing issues of global concern. This year's forum is co-sponsored with the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies and the Center for Population and Development at Harvard University, as well as the Healthy Aging and Care Network of Oxford Brookes University. I'd like now to turn it over to my good colleague and partner, Masaya Shimoyama, Director General of the New York office of the Japan Foundation.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from snowing New York City. Welcome and thank you for attending this program from across the globe. I am Shimoyama Masaya, Director of the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, or CGP, and Director General of the Japan Foundation New York office. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to be with you here for this Abe Global Forum 2022, highlighting the exceptional diverse expertise of the Abe Fellowship Network of more than 400 fellows formed over these past 30 years. It is, I believe, one of the most successful of our programs in United States. This is not possible without sustained support and dedicated partnerships. So let me start by deeply thanking to SSRC for their continued partnership since the inception of this program. Next, a thank you to the Reischauer Institute of Japan Studies, the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies, and the Oxford Brookes Healthy Aging and Care Network for working with us on this timely and very important global issue. And to all of you, those both in the program and in the audience, it has been a difficult number of years for everyone, and we appreciate your efforts and thank you for being part of this online event, despite the Zoom fatigue you are all experiencing. Briefly, CGP's mission is to provide an open and approachable space for the facilitation and promotion of joint Japan-US collaboration to fulfill our shared global responsibilities to contribute to the improvement of the world's welfare. Further, we are dedicated to strengthening both the global US-Japan partnership and the next generation of public intellectuals and leaders necessary to sustain this partnership. As we turned 30 years last year, not me, I'm much more older, but bearing in mind changes in the world highlighted by COVID-19, the evolution of the US-Japan relation partnership, and the issues confronting the global community, CGP created new funding priorities. We are concentrating our efforts on 3 thematic areas with the expressed aim to develop experts and leaders in Japan and the United States who can resolve the myriad global challenges before us. Those 3 thematic areas are the first, building a resilient society, and the second, developing an inclusive society, and the third, creating a society enriched by science and technology. Needless to say, today's timely and important topic, polishing Japan's silver. I think this naming is very, very wonderful. And then, this fits one squarely within this realm. We believe that together Japan and the United States have much to offer the rest of the world. So without further ado, thank you again for your attention, and let's move on to the program. Thank you. Ron?
Thank you so much, Shimoyama-san. And it's great to continue this partnership on such an important issue. I'd now like to turn things over to Mary Britton, the moderator of our panel today. Mary is the Reischauer Institute Professor of Sociology and the Director of the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies at Harvard University. And I'd like to add a 1994 Fellow of the Abe Program. Mary's research focuses on gender inequality, labor markets and employment, social demography, and contemporary Japanese society, which makes her an ideal moderator for today's topic. Mary, please take it from here and let's get to the interesting stuff.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And first of all, I have to say that I appear to be a bit technologically challenged today because, at least on my screen, the background is reversed. The lettering is backwards. I don't know if that appears on your screen or not, but I'm so sorry. So I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this panel. And the structure, which we hope will work really very well to engage our audience today, is going to be as follows. I'll make a few brief introductory comments, and then I'm going to introduce each of our speakers briefly, and each of them will have a very brief opportunity to talk about some of the main focuses of their research. We will then come back to me as moderator, and I will pose some questions individually to each speaker. That will be followed by more of a panel discussion, a few general questions for the panel as a whole, and then we will open it up to all of you for audience, and we hope we can have a great deal of discussion between the audience and the panel. So let me just say a few words about the situation that Japan finds itself in at the moment. As all of us know, Japan has the distinction of being the most rapidly aging society in the world. Now, currently, South Korea and Hong Kong have the lowest birth rates in the world. But Japan's birth rate began its decline much earlier, in the 1970s. And that is why the so-called population pyramid or age structure of Japan is so top-heavy, with nearly 30% of the population over age 65. It is projected that by the year 2050, the size of the over 65 population in Japan will be larger than the population in the prime working ages of 25 to 54. Now, while societies with a high population of very young adults may face high unemployment and ensuing social unrest, societies such as Japan with a high proportion of older adults face a different set of social and economic issues. Rising and perhaps unsustainable pension costs, the need for increased investment in healthcare, including technology and capital investments, as well as the need for more healthcare and elder care workers. The need to provide support for the so-called middle generation, those family members who may be in the labor force and at the same time be caring for their children as well as their aging parents. The consumer market in Japan has changed dramatically. In 2016, it was announced that for the first time, more adult diapers were sold in Japan than baby diapers. And one only needs to go to be in Japan, not only in the countryside, but in large cities, to sense the difference in the environment. Many more older people, fewer baby carriages, fewer mothers and fathers with their toddlers attached to their baby carriers to their chest. So the environment has changed deeply, and Japan has many issues to confront. Now, Japan is hardly the only country confronting these issues. Throughout the post-industrial world, Europe, all regions of Europe, North America, and East Asia, birth rates have fallen. And as I mentioned, South Korea and Hong Kong are now at the lowest, have the lowest birth rates in the world. But as I also mentioned earlier, what is distinctive about Japan, along with Italy, is that birth rates have been low for a very long time. And that is the reason that the age structure has been so strongly affected. So Japan has been following this path for many years, and in the 21st century has important issues to face. Now, in my own research, I focus at the other end of the age spectrum. My focus is on the low birth rate, family policies in the workplace, and so forth, to help young families and to possibly raise the birth rate, to help work-family balance be better in Japan, and so forth. But today, we are very fortunate to have 4 former Abe Fellows who focus on the issues regarding the aging population. So I'd like to introduce each of them and give them a chance to introduce themselves. Our first panelist is Jason Danley. Jason was a 2017 Abe Fellow. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of California, San Diego, and followed this with postdoctoral fellowships at the Center on Age and Community at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Jason is currently the chair of the Healthy Aging and Care Research Innovation and Knowledge Exchange Network at Oxford Brookes University. He has been engaged for the past 15 years in research on aging and care in Japan. In 2021, Jason co-edited with 2 colleagues the volume Vulnerability and the Politics of Care, published by Oxford University Press. And he's currently finishing a book. He has a forthcoming book, Fragile Resonance, Caring for Elderly Family in Japan and England. And his current project, which he won't be speaking about today, is a book about the resettlement of formerly incarcerated older adults in Japan. And that book will be published by Vanderbilt University Press. So I would like to give the floor to Jason to introduce the main points that he'd like to begin with today. Jason?
Thank you very much, Mary, for that kind introduction. And also thank you to the organizers of this Abe Global Forum. It's wonderful to be with all of these other panelists to discuss matters that are really important to me, that have been a big part of my research over the years, and that I think currently are urgent, even more urgent than they have been. I mean, as we continue to grapple with this global pandemic that's already cost millions of lives, 3/4 of which are older people, at least, and higher in some other countries. I think that it's incredibly important that we take a hard look at issues of sustainability and aging, not just in Japan, but I think across the world. After all, we're all growing older, and hopefully we'll live nice long lives. So we have an interest in investing in this shared life together in the future. And now the pandemic has also placed a magnifying glass on not only the physical vulnerability of older people, but also other forms of inequality and disadvantage they face. Older people in Japan are about 4 times as likely as other age groups to be living below the poverty line. Nearly 70% say that they have difficulty sort of getting by and providing for themselves. We have rising temperatures, floods, other kinds of natural events that seem to be exacerbated, intensified by the climate crisis. And these are disproportionately affecting older people in Japan. This is a very serious moment, I think, to really, we need to really reflect on, what aging in Japan really means. And I think it's time to take action, of course, right? Not just to react, but also to think transformatively. How can we really leverage this moment into substantial long-term change? And so this theme of sustainability, I think, is really important. In my research with older people and people who are caring for older adults in Japan, it's led me to believe that this transformation has to go beyond simply the old models that we have. For example, improving the health of older people. That's very important, but we have to go beyond that. We have to go beyond just finding more care workers for what may be an insufficient care system. We have to go beyond. And no, I don't believe that the future of sustainable aging lies entirely with robots. They might play a part in this, but I think that Japan has a lot of resources when it comes to care. I think really transforming care in Japan is going to mean integrating the formal and the informal care sectors, and really making a society-wide commitment to the critical importance of care. I think it's unsustainable, and I think it's unacceptable to have the care staff shortages causing poor working conditions, burnout, and high turnover rates. I think it's terrible that the unpaid carers who I spoke to in my research felt it was pretty normal. They all felt they had frequent times in which they thought about suicide or homicide or both. And for me, that right there speaks to this fact that we may not be taking care of the carers enough. But what gives me hope in this situation is that even though care is exhausting and individual carers might become exhausted, collectively, I don't think there is a lack of care. I interviewed dozens of carers in my research in Japan. Most of whom are post carers now, whose care has ended. But from those individuals, time and time again, I heard that they wanted to continue caring, that they kind of missed that. They now had skills, and that they had a new emotional sensitivity and empathy that they didn't have before. And they wanted to use that, right, to do some sort of good, to do some sort of care. And so there was this gap. Some of them did go into paid care. Some of them worked doing volunteer work in different capacities. I think if we can leverage that care, if we can make use of that by getting the informal and formal care sectors to work together more closely, that could really transform the whole way, the paradigm of care in Japan. How am I doing on time, Mary? Am I all right?
You are perfect. You can take a few more seconds, otherwise we'll move on.
Okay. I don't want to talk too much about the long-term care system as it is, besides to say that although I think it has improved care and that a lot of people are taking advantage of the resources that are available, I think that we can go beyond, and especially when it comes to including informal unpaid carers. And I often heard frustrations from paid carers saying, I see this family that wants to help, but they're getting isolated, they're getting burned out, and I can't do anything for them in the current system. You know, that to me is a terrible loss of an amazing resource. So I think the more that we can catch this resource, the more that we can put care at the center of society, really, the more sustainable the system is going to be. And there are examples, there are lots of examples of innovations in which institutions have tried to break down the barrier between the family and professionals, between the formal and informal care, and it builds relationships, it builds community, and older people are able to thrive in this as carers and as people who are being cared for. So I do have a lot of hope, even in these very uncertain and difficult times.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jason. This was a perfect segue into the introduction of our next panelist, Atsushi Miyawaki. Atsushi is a 2019 Abe Fellow. He received his MD and PhD from the University of Tokyo. And Atsushi studies health policy and program evaluation, especially in relation to vulnerable populations such as the elderly. And indeed, very much related to what Jason has just discussed, much of Atsushi's current research focuses on the health of informal, i.e. family caregivers in Japan, and the implications of the availability of formal long-term care services for informal caregivers' health and well-being. So very much the intersection that Jason was referring to between formal care services in Japan and the long-term, health insurance system and informal caregivers. So this porous boundary, we hope, porous between the informal and the formal care. Atsushi is also a visiting researcher at the UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine. So Atsushi, please tell us a little more about your research.
Thank you for introduction, Mary, and also thank you for good presentation for Jason, and that's very good introduction for my presentation today. So today I want to talk about the health of family caregivers, informal caregivers, and how the long-term care system in Japan is associated with it. And the burden of caregiving can affect caregivers in many ways. For example, many studies have shown that caregivers have a lower employment rate and higher risk of depression. And in addition, caregivers may be at risk of developing severe physical conditions. That's my study. So today, let me introduce some of my research about this issue, and I share my presentation slides. Give me a second. I hope you can see this slide. And this figure is from our epidemiological study of a representative sample of 50 to 50-year-olds in Japan. We followed up this sample for 5 years from 2005. In this study, family caregivers who spent more than 20 hours per week caring for family members were 1.8 times more likely to develop coronary heart disease than non-caregivers, people who don't care to their families. And this association is particularly significant among women. And caregiving more than 20 hours per week may seem unusual for some audience from some countries, but OECD services, it's still common in Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, or Southern European countries. Our study showed that caregiving for more than 20 hours accounted for 1/5 of all caregivers in Japan. And in another epidemiological study that followed a general population cohort in Gunma Prefecture, Japan, for 10 years, the all-cause mortality death rates didn't differ between caregivers and non-caregivers. However, this association differs by socio-economic status. For example, in the group in the lowest income quartile, the left side, caregivers were 1.5 times higher mortality rate than non-caregivers. Finally, we are living in the current pandemic situation, and here's data on the psychological stress of caregivers in Japan during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is an internet-based survey for 28,000 people aged 15 to 79 years, conducted in September 2020. In this study, we found that the magnitude in the deterioration of mental health after the pandemic was larger for caregivers than non-caregivers. For example, 10% of caregivers felt new suicidal ideation versus 4% of non-caregivers. We guess that the fear for the COVID infection or the inadequate access to formal care after the pandemic for the prevention of COVID spread may have contributed to these psychological burdens. So, as these findings suggest, taking care of family members often harms caregivers' health, mentally and physically, and the burden is disproportionately distributed in our society. This is problematic given that most family caregivers are middle-aged to early elderly and thus expected to play an important role in our labor market. So how can our social system solve these problems? To address this issue, we considered a policy change in Japan's long-term care insurance system as a quasi-experiment, so natural experiment. And in this study, the Japanese government has been, as you know, the Japanese government has been revising the long-term care insurance system every 3 years since 2000. That's the time of introduction of long-term care insurance system in Japan. And among them, the 2006 revision was significant changes, which reduced the benefits only for the care benefits for service use only for care recipients with low care needs, but they didn't change among those with high care needs. So this is a good comparison. We can look at the impact of limiting care benefits on caregivers' health by comparing the caregivers affected by this policy change with those who are not affected. And as a result, as this figure shows, caregivers who were affected by the policy change, orange line, were relatively more likely to complain of subjective poor self-rated health and symptom of depressive state and musculoskeletal disease like back pain. This increase was along with reduced use of formal long-term care service and increased time of informal care. And these results show that paradoxically, the benefits of the long-term care insurance system should positively affect the health of caregivers. And these findings shall suggest that it will be necessary to pay more attention to the issue of family caregivers when considering the future policy of long-term care benefits in Japan. And under the current, financial constraint in Japan, our government will further reduce long-term care insurance benefits coverage in the future. And in such case, it is important. It is important to assess the impact of caregivers as well as the care recipient and then reflect it on the next policy. Such policy refinement would contribute to achieving sustainable social system in our aging societies. That's my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Atsushi. So this brings us quite naturally to another topic, which is the specialty of Angela Chin. Angela is a 2018 Abe Fellow. She's Associate Professor of History at Pomona College. Angela received her PhD in History, Feminist Studies from UC Santa Cruz. And she has worked on transformations of urban identity and citizenship, as well as transregional connections in modern and contemporary China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Japan. But her current research is about the development and use of assistive technologies for disabled and elderly people in Asia. So here is where issues of robotics begin to enter in. So Angela will introduce her research about technologies and assistive devices, and then I'll introduce Joseph Coleman after that. So Angela.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint as well. Can you all see? Okay, good. Let me do it. So I'm going to talk about the assistive technologies, and according to the estimates by the National Institute of Population and Social Security Council, Social Security Research, Japan's total population will decline from around 125 million in 2020 to 110 million in 2040. By age group, the total number of elderly people will increase from about 35 million currently to around 40 million in the 2040s. In addition, it is expected that the number of elderly people over 75 will exceed 25% of the total population by 2055. So my research focuses on the invention of technologies and also the imaginations of how older people or people with disability can participate in society in the future. So I want to talk about two examples here of assistive technologies. One is the muscle suit. Here it's I use the case of Inofis. So there's this commercial as shown in the slide, the left-hand side. So the idea of the commercial is that there were these three children, and they're saying their parents and their grandmother, they were very active before, and then recently they have been suffering from back pain. So life is not fun anymore because like they cannot enjoy life. So the solution they came up with is this Inofis muscle suit. So it helps all three of them. And then I find it interesting because it reflects the three functions of such a muscle suit. And it's also kind of the three ideals for such kind of assistive technologies. And those functions are, first, that it helps the elderly users to be independent. So it helps the grandmother to be active again. And secondly, it reduces the burden of care. So it helps the mother in taking care of the grandmother. And thirdly, it extends the working life of workers. So the father can be working actively and lifting things again. So So I find that idea of what is ideal very interesting. And another example that I want to mention is the telenoid. So the telenoid is this robot that looks like a small child with ambiguous facial features. And using AI technology, the remote operator or the care worker orally communicates with the patient through a camera installed in the head of the telenoid. The inventors of telenoid and many of these AI technologies do not work in the field of elderly care or disability, but they see the potential use of the robotic inventions in the area of care work. So here you see the operator remotely operating and then kind of watching the patient through the computer screen and interacting through the robot. So I also want to mention that assistive technologies is not just about robots. So they also include welfare devices that I would say is like low-tech self-help devices. So on the left here in the picture 1 and 2, those are the low-tech devices designed by local community members. So those are for like a bowl holder or like a nail clipper for people who have difficulties using both arms. So they can just use one hand or one arm to eat or to clip the nail. But of course, it also includes the more high-tech side of technologies. And here is Pepper, a semi-humanoid robot manufactured by SoftBank. And it is now commonly used in elderly facility, especially after COVID. And below is Paro, is a robot baby heart seal. And the description says it is intended to be very cute and to have a calming effect and elicits emotional responses in patients of hospitals and nursing homes. So in Japan, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare approved a policy called the Priority Areas to which robots technology to be introduced in nursing care in 2012. And since then, it has been giving out grants and awards to the inventors of Kaigo robots or care robots. And government support is also given out through funding of research as well as subsidies for users through the national insurance system. The ministries also give subsidies to rehabilitation centers and other institutions such as elderly home. So because of the network in the field, telecommunications and the Japanese government sponsorship in advanced technology, some of these devices are featured in international expos and eventually end up in a network of technological commodity circulation that spans the world. So some of these expos you might have seen in advertised, including the HCR, the Healthcare and Rehabilitation Equipment Expo, or the Care and Rehabilitation Expo, etc. So I just want to end with this slide to show that even though it may seem like everything looks very high tech and advanced, even in Japan, the most advanced assistive technologies are not widely available to the public, and they are currently very expensive. So the example that I gave, Talanoid, for example, it requires care workers to take training courses before they can operate them. So as a result, their availability and usage may remain very limited in the near future. As of 2020, when I did my research in Japan, only about a dozen nursing homes in Japan have used Talanoid in a trial basis. And further development of high-tech technology, such as the Talanoid, may even widen the gap between those who can afford them and those who cannot. So I'm going to talk more about the nature of care work maybe in the next session and in the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Angela. So now let me introduce our fourth panelist, Joseph Coleman. Joe is in the fortunate position of having had 2 Abe Fellowships, one in 2009 and one in 2015 for journalism. In 2015, Joe was an Abe Journalist Fellow. Joe is the Roy W. Howard Professor of Practice in Journalism at Indiana University. He joined Indiana University after a 20-year career as a journalist with the Associated Press, reporting on a variety of social and political issues across the globe, and serving as the Associated Press bureau chief in Tokyo from 2004 to 2009. In 2015, he published Unfinished Work, The Struggle to Build an Aging American Workforce, published by Oxford University Press. And in this book, he profiles the stories of aging workers in the US, Japan, France, and Sweden. So really bringing a comparative lens to the elderly and especially to the issue of work and aging. So Joe will briefly introduce his research.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me and giving me the opportunity. And thanks to Abe for its generosity with my research over the past 10 years. As Mary mentioned, I'm a journalist by training, and so I approach this less as a social scientist and more as sort of a storyteller. And so I focused a lot on individual stories of not only individuals, but also companies that are groping their way through this kind of new normal where because of rapid aging in Japan, you have fewer younger workers or fewer people of traditional working age to fill the factories, to do all the work that needs to be done in the world's 3rd largest economy. Why is this such an issue? Well, I guess maybe I should start by saying why I was attracted to this issue in the first place. One was that when I was working as a reporter in Japan, I just noticed that I was writing about aging a lot. Not necessarily by design at first, but just because that seemed to be, one of the kind of like developments, societal developments that journalists tend to pay attention to. And I also found that I was writing a lot about older workers very often, sometimes inadvertently, and not even on purpose, looking for older workers. You just end up talking to workers who happen to be elderly. And I realized that this is an issue that goes beyond, just the statistics. And then, of course, I realized that actually, when you look at labor force participation rates across the sort of so-called advanced industrialized nations in Europe, North America, and East Asia, Japan was in many ways the leader in labor force participation rate for older people. There's a big gender gap, between men and women in that case, but overall, as taken when you include all genders together, it's still very, very high, and it's only gotten higher in the years since I did my my research. So why is this such an issue? It's an obvious financial issue. As you get fewer people working, the government tax revenue starts to decrease, and so the government needs more money. As you move more people, larger groups of people onto pension and other welfare programs for the elderly, increased costs. So there's a problem there. Labor force. You just need a certain number of workers to run a factory, to run a business, as particularly the baby boomer generation that was born in the years after World War II started to move into that 60-year-old age bracket, people started worrying that we're going to have a huge number of workers suddenly leaving the workforce all around the same time. So the mass exodus of the people who played such a pivotal role in building post-war Japan through sort of the glory years of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Longer lifetimes, many people devote so much time to our work, and I think this is true across cultures, but definitely what I noticed in Japan was a very strong identification between individuals and their place of work and their role in that, and their sort of role as a worker in society. And if you're giving someone with a longer lifespan 20, 30 years, that's going to be post-work. We all hear there's that phrase sodai gomi, which is somewhat pejorative phrase for the retiree who after 40 years of working long hours is now suddenly in the home, kind of in the way, right? So a lot of people are looking for something to do with their lives. They're still healthy, they're still vibrant, they still have all the experience and knowledge that they had 10 years ago or 20 years ago. They still want to put that to use. Again, in Japan, some remarkable statistics. 10 years ago, when I was looking at this, people age 65 and older were 6.7% of the Japanese workforce. Now it's more than double in just the past 10 years. Let's see. Compared to the United States, for instance, where people age 65 to 75 in the United States are 26.6% labor force participation rate. In Japan, you have something closer to 40% participation rate for people between 65 and 75. What did I find when I went around and talked to a lot of these people and talked to a lot of those companies? Was that it was really a mixture of driving this was a mixture of government policy. For instance, over the past 10 or 15 years, the government has gradually raised the retirement age from 60 to 65. So that's been sort of a motivating force, and they put not really requirements, but recommendations to companies to come up with ways of lengthening their employees' time at work and encouraging people to come back to work well into their 60s. But also what I found, the greatest innovations that I found in Japan were in companies that were away from Tokyo, away from Osaka, that were in the countryside, where just as a matter of survival, they had to figure out ways of attracting and retaining older workers in their workforce. Otherwise, they were not going to survive. And that's where you really found the kind of innovations that really make the idea of working at older ages sustainable. Ergonomic design so that there's less wear and tear on the body, flexible schedules to take into consideration that very often, a worker in their 60s may also have elder care issues at home with an elderly parent in their 80s or 90s. Very often the case in Japan, and they can't work 9 to 5 every day, and they need flexible hours. So that's where I really found the biggest innovations. One final thing before I go. And I guess my hope is that as Japan confronts this issue that Japan not only finds, or Japanese companies or the rest of us really find better ways to employ older workers, but that those innovations have the possibility of actually making work life better for everybody, right? More ergonomic design, better scheduling, more consideration for workers is something that could benefit the workforce as a whole and not only elderly workers. So yeah, looking forward to joining in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. As you were speaking, I was reminded of a book that was a hot bestseller in Japan when I was last in Japan, which was, of course, a little over 2 years ago. But The 100-Year Life, which I had never heard of until I was in Japan. And when I went to visit people at the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare for discussions about the other end of the age spectrum, the birth rate, the lack of babies in Japan, I saw this book, The 100-Year Life, on many, many bureaucrats' desks. And I think it really, the appeal of that book, which I bought, but I have not read, I have to confess, the appeal of that book, both to bureaucrats, I think, and to ordinary individual Japanese, was indeed what you have pointed us to, that people are living longer, they're living healthier, and, you know, life is, sometimes I say life is for a long time. If you're lucky, life is for a long time. And you've raised this issue of the importance of work for identity in Japan. So the importance of work to individuals wanting to work. There's a financial need on the part of many older people needing to work. And then at the macro level, the value of older workers for the economy, because there aren't enough younger workers. Japan already faces quite a severe labor shortage, and it's not going to get any better in the near term. So your work and discussion really touches on a number of issues. So we're going to kind of come back to the center now, and I have a few questions, 1 or 2 questions for every panelist, and then some general questions for the panel as a whole. But we also want to be sure to have time for the audience to raise questions. So I think what I will do is give a question to each of the panelists, and then also throw out a general question so that you each have a question of your own that you can address if you'd like to, and then a general question for all of you. And I think that might cut back a little bit on the wasting any time going back and forth between me and all of you. So, and I do want to come back to the overview as well, building on things that Joe said about the fact that since Japan is a forerunner, Japan is really the pioneer, for good or for, you know, luck or not so lucky, pioneer in becoming a super aging society. And so one of the things that all of us are interested in the panel, and I think in the audience as well, is what can we learn from Japan? You know, what are the things that Japan is engaged in, industry and the government and individuals and families? What are the things that they're engaged in, the innovations that they're coming up with that are examples? Because the rest of the world is going to need, post-industrial world right now, is going to have a lot to learn from Japan. And so even though it's a difficult set of issues for the government and for society in Japan, it's an opportunity, you know, for a lot of innovation, as all the speakers have said, and a lot of positive examples that perhaps other countries will be able to learn from as they go through this journey. So let me pose to Jason the issue that he raised a bit and was touched on just slightly by a few of the other presenters, what is the gender dimension when we're talking about care, both formal, but maybe particularly informal, because we often think of informal caregivers as primarily women. To what extent is that the case? And how are relationships affected within the family, intergenerationally, and maybe even, I don't know if you've studied spousal relationships, but again, the demands in 3-generation households or 3 generations linked even in a neighborhood or in a small geographical space, the demands, time demands, emotional demands, if we could talk a little bit about that and the gender dimension. And for Atsushi, if you could talk a little bit more about what do we know and what do we need to know and learn about this intersection between the long-term care insurance system and informal caregiving. So as Jason also mentioned, what is the boundary, the interaction between formal and informal caregiving and the financial implications in particular of the long-term care insurance system. You showed us some very striking results from your recent empirical analyses. For Angela, pretty obvious question that I think we all have is, how are the technologies that you're describing changing the nature of elderly care? And again, the relationships, right? The human relationships between the elderly and their caregivers. I suppose, again, both formal caregiver, primarily formal caregivers, I would imagine, with the assistive technologies. And then Joe, again, the issues that are so pertinent with regard to the older population and large motivation among many older people to continue working, either in their current job or to find a job that is not demeaning, right? Is not kind of going back down to the bottom of the income structure. So jobs that are meaningful to themselves, meaningful to society. And again, there's just a huge potential there, I think. Younger families need a lot of help as well. And because grandparents are often not around. And there are a lot of older people who would love to have, I think, a lot more contact with kids and younger families. And that would be quite innovative, to try to figure that out. But in any case, so that's a question for each of you, and we could probably talk for the next hour or two about just those questions. But I'll just throw out a general question for the panel that you can all be considering as well. What direction is Japan's aging society heading? Where are we headed? What are the most promising directions that Japan is headed in? So let's see. I guess, and we're going to then turn to an audience, set of audience questions. So maybe you can all turn off your mute buttons, or I should say, turn on your voices, and perhaps go in the order that we went in: Jason, Atsushi, Angelina, and Joe. But feel free to interact a bit with each other if you'd like to. And I think we can probably only spend about 10 to 15 minutes on this, and then we'll turn to the audience. But let's start with you, Jason, since you were first in our lineup.
Sure, I will do my best to limit the time, but you'd like me to respond in a way to all of these, the general question as well as my sort of individual question?
Why don't you respond to your individual question, and then if it starts going into the general question, that's fine too.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I think the gender topic is really important here. As you say, I think informal caregiving in particular, but the professional paid care sector as well is predominantly women at the moment. And so all of those aspects of burden that Atsushi was showing so clearly in his data are things that are disproportionately affecting. But gradually over the years, we have seen an increase in men who are providing care, right? And especially as spousal caregivers are becoming the more dominant form of care for older adults. I think that is going to increase. And I had the privilege of joining during my field work. I joined one of these support groups for men who are carers. And I found that I found a lot of hope in these groups, right? These were men, most of them were retired, caring for spouse or for a parent. They were creating this space in which they could really explore and talk about their emotional life and what was going on with them and their identity, and I think remaking masculinity and what that meant and how that was associated with the work that they did. It was really inspiring, right? And a lot of them, I think, did a lot of work to try to change the image of men who care, to sort of get rid of the stigma. And I think as you have more and more men who are caring, more and more men, I think, are now having to leave work to care. And so this is becoming a more sort of public topic. But I think you are going to have different kinds of shifts in the gender roles. On the other hand, I see in the informal care, the tendency instead of for the wife to take care of her in-laws and her own parents, or something like that. She might take care of her own parents, she might not. But generally she won't take care of her in-laws, and maybe that'd be up to her husband, right? So you have this division in the care, and you have women that are refusing to take on a lot of this care, especially when they maybe don't get along with the person that they care for. So I think that women are feeling a bit more empowered, and I think that's a good sign. I think there's more progress to be made in that. But I think it's very interesting that we don't often associate the aging society with maybe a more equal gender roles in society. Maybe the opposite. But I think there are signs that this might be happening in Japan's case, at least.
Well, that's very interesting, because also, given that the birth rate has had such a long, slow decline, it means that this middle generation is small as well, right? So we're not talking about necessarily maybe 3 or 4 siblings who can share, a husband who has 3 siblings and a wife who has 3 siblings, so that the care of the elderly in-laws and parents can be distributed across a lot of people. It's coming down to a small number of, working age adults. And so that makes a lot of sense, that it may, in a kind of ironic way, maybe becoming a little more gender equal, because everybody has to, kind of chip in. more so than if you had these huge families, you know, and all these siblings in their 40s or 50s, but that's not the case.
Right, and I think this is not yet reflected as much in the paid care work.
Right.
I think that they have to catch up and
Yeah,
with it.
yeah, exactly. So Atsushi, do you want to add to your comments earlier about the long-term care insurance program and how that intersects with paid and unpaid care?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm a health service researcher, so quantitative method. I'm using quantitative method, and I have, yeah, so much interest in the system of long-term care insurance.
Yeah.
So in this perspective, I think there's some gap in knowledge on the effectiveness of long-term care services provided now in Japan. So I mean, there is lack or insufficiency of evidence regarding the impact or cost effectiveness of long-term care service. So we have, I'm a medical doctor also, and we have a bunch of knowledge on clinical evidence regarding effectiveness of medical care services provided in Japan, but this is not the case for long-term care services. So yeah, for example, I'm working as geriatrician and going to patient's home as providing home care at home, and I see a lot of, I have a lot of chance to see home care helper providing some services in their patient's home.
I see.
But I think from the perspective, from my perspective, it's unclear whether or not all home health services are effective or cost effective for caregivers or care recipients. For example, some home health services like cooking, shopping, cleaning may be effectively replaceable by some private, private sector services. And this is my opinion. I don't have good data, but also the government, current Japanese government has tried to promote home care.
Right.
But it's not clear, I think, which home care or institutional care is more appropriate for each individual or each household.
So what kind of mix, the mix of institutional and home care, the mix that's appropriate?
Yeah. So so institutional care, so using nursing home or
right.
More, Japan has Japan has some level of institutional care, nursing home and group home, or many kinds of, but regardless of that, institutional care is maybe appropriate for some household when accounting for the burdens of or loss of opportunity cost of caregivers, I think. So this is ongoing topic. So and another topic may be the variety of care, the variety of quality of care between care facilities. And anyway, I think it is required to more explore which services is really beneficial to care recipients, caregivers, and still lack largely also there is a lot of gap between the in terms of evidence of long-term care services. So I think this is future way we researchers and policy makers have to address in the future.
And I think in the US, we also have a real gap in knowledge. It's very hard to navigate this landscape of long-term care. It's different in many ways than in Japan, and of course there are also important cultural differences, but it's really the future of our societies to figure out how best to serve older members of society and care for them. And there are a lot of different options, and as you said, there's cost effectiveness as a consideration, and then there's the level of care, right, that is provided. And Angelina, okay, where do robots enter in? And have you done any research yet on the impact on relationships between caregivers and the elderly, the impact of robotic interventions?
So I went to many of these care technology expos, and what I've noticed is that they have seminars like while they're having the expos. So a large number of these seminars, interestingly, are about like data management, like how do you share those data of these like elderly people, like about like what they eat, or like how do you collect data with them, and who do you share this data with? So I can see that there's more attention paid to the patterns of behaviors, or even like thinking of the elderly through AI data collections. So perhaps like in the long run, in terms of like, if we think about the quality of life of the elderly, maybe I think that the safety and also perhaps some of the research on the like people with dementia, like how do you keep up a conversation with them, like this kind of in this sense of quality of life, it will be improved by technologies. And also I think technologies, especially if you're thinking about like robots to accompany or watch over the elderly with dementia, may reduce the labor and stress for the care workers. But I think we should also pay attention to the possibility of the increase of the patient's sense of social alienation and infantilization by technologies, like because when you give them a toy, like sometimes you don't tell them whether it's a baby or a toy, and then it's a little bit of deceiving the elderly. So I think this we should pay more attention to the mental health and the effects of technology on the elderly's sense of alienation. So and in terms of I think Japan's uniqueness, I think there are a few observations that I found. One is that robotics have been commonly used in Japan, so there's much less awkwardness to see robots in an elderly setting, and Japan has been more advanced than many other nations in terms of using AI technologies and robotics, like in a care setting. So I think like maybe other countries can learn from some of the mistakes, or complement what Japan has been doing, and maybe I think like for maybe the US and European countries, like there is more attention on the psychological aspect of it. So that can be I think shared with Japan. And another observation that I have about Japan in terms of universal design is that there's a, a very specific use of space. Like, for example, there's a clear separation of the indoor space and outdoor space. You're supposed to take off your shoes, right, when you go indoors. So, and especially in the cities of Japan, like Osaka and Tokyo, then there's a lack of space in homes. So some of the designs, like interior designs for the elderly, may be especially useful for Asian cities that also have small apartments and small spaces.
Right.
And so I think that's like a very that's something that is quite uniquely like East Asian, because like I think if you compare those codes of like the disability code like in the US, and then sometimes it's not applicable in Japan because Japan has a small space, and then the wheelchairs are smaller in Japan. So when a wheelchair user from the States come to Japan, sometimes they cannot go to the bathroom, even though it is called a universal bathroom. So I think that's something that we should pay attention to. And another thing I want to mention, the last thing I want to mention, since I think there is a lot of kind of attention to foreign care workers like coming to Japan. So a lot of these technologies like require kind of technical communications that's you need like a pretty decent Japanese language skills.
Yes.
So and then a lot of these technologies don't have like enough translations or explanations. So if there are elderlies who are foreigners or who are not native speakers of Japan living in Japan, then it's very difficult for them to receive the same quality of care, and also for the care workers who may be coming from abroad. So so they may have difficulty adopting to the new system of care that may require more knowledge on information technology and Japanese language.
Well, you've perhaps without knowing it, you've addressed some of the questions from the audience, which have to do with whether there's specific research on using robots to care for people with dementia, which you touched on, that's a really important area, and also the kind of sometimes the elephant in the room from one audience member: why is immigration often overlooked as a practical solution to the waning, aging workforce? You began to touch on that. So let me turn to Joe as we get into workforce issues, and if you want to just add to anything to your early comments about the labor force participation possibilities for the elderly.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, Mary, you mentioned the question about mixing the generations, or sort of like cross-generational work, and certainly that happens very often, in factories and so on, where there's a large number of workers. I mean, I've seen both cases where there's a large factory and there are workers of all ages working together, and then sometimes with these smaller factories where it was predominantly older people who were working, and
they can't get younger people to work there.
But the interesting thing is that actually, and this happens in other places too, not only Japan, but very frequently one of the transitions companies can use to sort of transition older workers or aging workers into positions that have a bit more longevity involved with them. It is converting people into mentors, so that they're able to use sort of their experience and their knowledge and pass that on to a younger generation of workers. So it's actually a mutually beneficial thing, because the older worker gets to keep working. That's right. But at the same time, the company gets to hold on to that institutional knowledge, and it doesn't fade away, because that's a big problem that actually a lot of people have been increasingly worried about, because you've got a lot of workers like in the nuclear power industry, or even in like local utilities. This is a story that pops up all over the place in the United States, that we've got all these people who are, you know, technically skilled and have institutional knowledge, and they're all going to leave, and we're going to lose it all, right? So so yeah, mentoring is something that is a way for sort of like that. I mean, there are sort of drawbacks or problems that, you know, roadblocks. I was working, I was observing a company in Yamaguchi-ken. It was a company that made the nose cones of bullet trains for Hitachi. And all the guys, and the one reason that it was sort of so old school was that they were making these nose cones with hammers, like instead of, you know, because for any model of a bullet train, you only need a very limited number of nose cones. So it becomes, you know, economically efficient to do them one by one, rather than creating a whole machine with a model and everything.
I see.
You're just going to put out, you know, 10 or 20 of these things in a particular design, you know. For every train, you only need 2, right? So
I see.
But these guys, you know, they were late 60s, and the plan was that they would train a new generation, but they would get these younger workers who I don't want to say that they were kind of like slacker style guys, but but they were not into the idea of like hammering at the same piece of metal for 12 hours, and then you know, the older worker would say, you know, well, you know, they would just throw it out and say start again, and this would go on for months. And so, you know, there was a little sort of cross generational. Lots of times the younger trainees would just quit, you know. So
you know, I think sometimes we think, or perhaps I think, of social change in Japan as happening a little slowly. However, you know, if you think about the last 70 years, that, you know, so much has happened that there are sometimes very important generation gaps. So it's and that's a very, you know, the importance of generations working together in an aging society, you know, kind of brings generation gaps to the fore. I found in my own research to some extent that younger people who are having babies, those few who are having babies in Japan, if their parents live far away, they have kind of a thirst for getting advice from an older generation, and they don't know where to go to get it. And so I think there's a kind of role, I don't know if it would be entirely informal or more formal, also of the older generation helping the younger generation, you know, with babysitting, or, you know, forms of mentoring, you know, because, you know, a lot of people live, again, their parents are in Yamaguchi, and they themselves are in Tokyo or whatever. So in any case, I think the intergenerational relationships are really, you know, a part of this discussion that really penetrates everything that we're talking about. The questions that are coming in from the audience are particularly focused on immigration, the role of immigration, which, you know, we don't have time to deal with thoroughly in this forum, but it's clearly a very, very important area. And the use of robotics. And one of the questions, for instance, for Angelina, had to do indeed with the, you know, the rather common, to some extent, usage of robotics in Japan in kind of manufacturing and so forth, and whether that has made people in general a bit more familiar or comfortable, I would say, with robotics. But one of a very specific question that one audience member raised for Angelina is whether these muscle suits are being used not just in elderly, the elderly scenario, but also in construction industry or other whether there are applications, beyond the elderly. So I think if any of you, Angelina, if you want to address that, and then if any of you want to be so bold as to further discuss the role of immigrants in the shortage of caregivers in Japan, then we could perhaps talk about that for a few minutes. We will be coming up to our time limit very shortly. But Angelina, if you want to just say a few more words about robotics, not just for the elderly, but in Japanese society.
Yeah. Before I do that, I just want to say an anecdote that I've told the panelists earlier. That's like this one friend of mine, a Japanese friend, and then she said that she would rather have a foreign care worker take care of her mother rather than a robot. So that's interesting. Maybe that's a question that many Japanese are thinking about these days.
I would imagine, yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I find it's kind of relevant to some of these questions about immigration. And then returning to this question about muscle suits, so there are different versions, and some of them are more expensive than others. So Innovis, I think belongs to a less expensive kind. The more expensive kinds, like Cyberdyne, can only be rented out because they're so expensive, and there are different versions of it, and some of it is for people with spinal cord injury, so they go to a center and rent like for an hour to train, to rehab, do rehabilitation training. So, but then the ones that is just for the lower back, it's sometimes used in factories. And the Innovis has been used in many factories, and you can also find many workers in the airport lifting heavy packages, wearing these muscle suits as well. So it's getting more popular, and companies have been using them for to help the workers.
Yeah, so that's an interesting general question. I mean, maybe I'm expanding too far from what you have talked about, but if the kind of general societal familiarity with robotics will make it easier, for robotics to be adopted in elder care to some extent, because I think that is more prevalent in Japan than in the United States. And but you raised, this very important question, which I'm sure is coming up all the time, which is better, a foreign worker, foreign caregiver, or a robot? And that raises all kinds of completely fascinating social science questions and very practical questions, not only for Japan, but for other aging societies. So I think we're almost at the time limit, and my apologies to audience members who very much wanted to talk about the immigration question. That wasn't built into our panel, but it's a big part of this. And of course, there's been quite a lot written about past experiences, past attempts by the Japanese government to bring in foreign care workers. Angelina raised some of the important issues there, one of which is the difficulty of the Japanese language, and the fact that it's difficult to operate in English, especially with elderly people. So there are a lot of important issues, and clearly we're talking about, a big bundle of needs on the part of the elderly, things that are very important for Japanese society, for the fiscal health of the government, and so forth. And again, we hope that to the audience, we hope that we've sparked your curiosity, because we could probably talk for another 10 hours together and continue. There are many, many, many important issues. I hope we've managed to touch on some of them. And please stay tuned, because I trust that this is going to continue to be a very important research area in Japanese studies, studies of Japan, and studies of other aging societies. Again, I would point to the comparative work that Jason has done on the UK and Japan, and Joe's earlier work on aging elderly workers across countries. So I hope these are issues that the OECD and other international organizations will be paying more and more attention to, and that we can have a lot of international exchanges as we all try to move forward for healthy societies. So thank you so much for your participation. Thank you very much to the panelists for your preparation and for the ability and willingness to squeeze your vast knowledge into small talking points. And thank you very much to SSRC and CGP and to our other sponsors for this colloquium. And we hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining this panel this afternoon, or whatever time of the day it is for you. Have a wonderful weekend. I won't repeat all the thank yous. Panelists, that was fantastic. Mary steered the conversation wonderfully. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. For our partners, and especially for the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. Lastly, a big thanks to my colleagues at SSRC for making this event happen and doing all the work behind the scenes. You know who you are. And it's been a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you all. A great, great discussion. Thanks for joining us.